Howdy y'all, welcome back. Today we're going to start a new series of videos, so I hope you're ready to take a deep dive into the first ever taken photographs of Egypt. According to the current narrative, an explosion of Egyptology began in roughly 1801 with the conclusion of Napoleon Bonaparte's French campaign in Egypt and Syria. During the stay of the French army in the Egyptian land, numerous pieces of history were founded or rediscovered, aspects of history which would forever change the world. The Rosetta Stone, essentially the missing piece to understanding ancient Egyptian writing, was discovered by the French in July of 1799. However, in total, Napoleon included 167 French savants on his conquest, the scientists and scholars of his empire. The analytical theory of heat was first proposed by French savants while they were in Egypt, and we're told the entire inclusion of the French scholars was to aid in the feasibility and construction of the Suez Canal. Which brings me to the topic of today's video. While Napoleon's conquest of Egypt not only immediately benefited France, it also benefited the rest of the world who seemed eager to visit Egypt, which was long an Ottoman stronghold. On the shoulders of the planned Suez Canal, we're told it took upwards of 20 years to collect, organize, and publish all the records and accounts of the French army and scholars during their time in Egypt. Once this information hit the proverbial mainstream, the wealthiest of the working class, and indeed large congregations of the well-off in the world, made their pilgrimage to Egypt. As the Industrial Revolution, spearheaded by advancements in road construction, rail lines, and overall travel, made its way into Egypt, and as Egyptology spread like wildfire throughout the inquisitive minds of the world, Egypt became a hotbed for scientific and wealthy minds alike. We are told with the rapid increase of European tourists into Egypt came a vast increase in the necessity of high-quality souvenirs. You may have heard about pieces of pyramids, inner chambers, tombs, or even Egyptian mummies themselves being put up for sale at the height of the Egyptian craze in the 19th century. However, by far the most popular souvenir became a photograph in front of one of these ancient epic creations in Egypt. We're told even though France granted most of the rights to Egypt to the British after Napoleon's campaign, the French scholars remained in Egypt, and with these French scholars came the rise of photography. What makes this absolutely brilliant to me, besides these images, which again, as you can see, are some of the finest and earliest photographs of Egypt, but what truly makes these images an anomaly are the photographers themselves. Today, we're going to look at the first photographs of Egypt taken exclusively by Hippolyte Arnoux. Hippolyte Arnoux produced hundreds of high-quality images throughout the mid to late 1800s, often credited as being the official photographer of the Universal Company of the Suez Canal. And yet, very little is known about his life. It's written that Arnoux was French, but in what year or even what city he was born, we do not know. Likewise, we also do not have a year given for his passing. Arnoux appears on no official records or documents in Egypt or France, besides his name appearing on hundreds of photographs and one court record. From these photographs, it is believed that Arnoux set up a studio in the French consulate to produce images of the construction of Port Said and the surrounding Suez Canal. Arnoux's photographs of the Suez Canal, which we will examine in great detail today, were said to have been produced in his floating darkroom, which he kept afloat on the canal. Although it is unclear when Arnoux first traveled to Egypt or if he lived there at the advent of photography, he appears to have been in Egypt around the same time that photography came to international limelight. And thus, somewhat mysteriously, Arnoux was able to produce some of the first photographs in Egypt, as well as the very first photographs of the Suez Canal and Port Said. I mean, just look at this photograph here. They are all so fascinating. Now, most of what we know today about Hippolyte Arnoux comes to us from an 1874 lawsuit where Arnoux instigated litigation against fellow Egyptian photographers, accusing them of usurping his intellectual property, claiming that their photographs to actually be his photographs from a much earlier collection. Arnoux was successful, and on June 29th of 1876, many of the first photographs of Egypt were accredited to this mysterious Arnoux. His documentation of the Suez Canal, as seen today, was considered the highlight of his career and a spectacle in the ability of photography in the mid-1800s. Considering the dry conditions of Egypt, these photographs appear to be taken from roughly 1849 through roughly 1879, making them even more remarkable. Miraculously, to put it into perspective, from the time that Napoleon, quote-unquote, rediscovered the monuments of ancient Egypt to the time of the first photographs, it's a span of roughly 50 years or roughly half a century. It's truly remarkable then to consider that roughly 225 years ago, almost no one on our earth, or a majority of people, had no idea about the Great Pyramid or Cairo or any other ancient monument of Egypt. America was apparently established at least 20 years before we truly have Egypt being understood as the concept it is today. 50 years from today, honestly, with technology for documenting history, 50 years from now and 50 years ago feel like it is right at our fingertips. So imagine how the pedestrians of the old world must have felt just 50 years after the quote rediscovery of Egypt, to then be graced with photographs so highly detailed like the ones we are looking at today. In my opinion, these images truly show a part of Egypt, a side to the history that feels isolated from the rest of time. These photographs are very detailed, very revealing, showcasing monumental architecture and old world craftsmanship that appears to be unparalleled in the ancient world. And yet for centuries, according to this narrative, most of these creations sat relatively dormant, relatively unknown, and relatively undocumented. It's only been a mere sliver of our written history that we've known that these structures truly existed. And for many of us, the true purpose to these ancient monuments in Egypt is even more eluding now than it would have been 225 years ago at the time of their first discovery. Work was said to have started on the Suez Canal at the shores of the future Port Said on April 25th of 1859. The excavation took some 10 years, with forced labor being used. Some sources estimate that over 30,000 people were working on the canal at any given moment, and that more than 1.5 million different people from various countries were employed over its entire creation. From its inauguration until 1925, the Suez Canal Company built a series of what they called company towns to serve the canal. These included Port Said, officially founded in 1869. This is the town where the mysterious Hippolyte Arnoux, towards the end of his career, floated his darkroom on the canal and took some of the finest photographs that we have of early Egypt, only for his story to seemingly be forgotten. I believe that's where I'm going to wrap up today's current narrative for the video. Definitely stay tuned for the rest of this video. If you haven't already, feel free to go back through this video and save any images that stand out to you. Throughout the next few days, I'm going to be going through the images that are accredited to the other earliest photographers of Egypt. As you'll come to find out, many of these photographers have a very mysterious history, one that is not well documented. All we have really remaining of these photographers are the images of Egypt, which really speaks volumes about the history at the time. But another thing that comes to the forefront is that these photographers often were claiming that their images had been taken by the other photographers. There was often lawsuits in the courts of Egypt, and that's how we actually have any documentation of these photographers at all. But it seems They were living really from paycheck to paycheck, from job to job, and they were not very wealthy. They were not very popular, even though the narrative explains that they were in Egypt because of the popularity of these souvenirs. And in the case of Arnoux, he was often credited as being the official photographer for the Suez Canal. So you have to wonder why this history is so mysterious if these figures were actually so important at the time. But I digress. Again, in the next few days, we're going to be looking at hundreds of photographs of Egypt, other photographs taken by other photographers, and we'll get into this history even more. So if you're not subscribed to the channel, please consider doing that. If you enjoyed today's video, please like, and I will also talk to you in the comments down below. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about Egypt, about this photographic process, and about the old world in general. I look forward to that discussion, and I can't wait to see you on the next video.